In the heart of Chicago's bustling Union Station, where thousands of travelers rush through marble corridors every single day, where the echoes of hurried footsteps blend with the distant rumble of arriving trains, where announcements crackle through speakers in multiple languages, an extraordinary story of loyalty and intelligence was about to unfold that would leave even the most seasoned police officers completely speechless. This is the story of Major Tom, an 82-year-old retired railroad engineer whose life had been defined by the rhythmic clatter of train wheels on steel tracks, and his remarkable companion Diesel, a chocolate Labrador whose intelligence would soon transcend every boundary of traditional service dog training in the most unexpected and brilliant way imaginable. Major Tom had spent 43 years of his life working the rails, starting as a young apprentice in the engine yards of Pennsylvania, working his way up through every position until he became one of the most respected locomotive engineers in the Midwest. His weathered hands had guided massive freight trains through mountain passes, passenger trains through bustling cities, and cargo trains across endless prairie landscapes under star-filled skies. The railroad wasn't just his job, it was his passion, his calling, the very essence of who he was. Even now, decades after his retirement, the sound of a train whistle could transport him back to those golden years when he felt most alive, most connected to something greater than himself. But life had dealt Major Tom a cruel hand in his later years. At 78, he had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition called narcolepsy with cataplexy, a devastating disorder that would steal away his mobility in the most unexpected moments. The condition was particularly cruel because it was triggered by intense emotions, especially joy and excitement. The very feelings that had once brought him the greatest happiness now posed the greatest danger. When Major Tom experienced overwhelming joy, nostalgia, or excitement, his brain would essentially short-circuit, causing every muscle in his body to go completely limp, while leaving his mind fully conscious and aware. He would collapse wherever he stood, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to even blink, trapped inside his own paralyzed body while remaining completely alert to everything happening around him. If you're finding yourself drawn into this incredible story of unwavering loyalty and remarkable intelligence, you're exactly where you need to be. Here at Lab of Love, we bring you the most extraordinary true stories of the bonds between humans and animals that will restore your faith in loyalty, love, and the incredible intelligence of our four-legged companions. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss the incredible stories we share every week that celebrate the amazing relationships between people and their beloved animals. It was because of this debilitating condition that Diesel had come into Major Tom's life 3 years earlier. Diesel wasn't just any service dog, he was specifically trained to provide stability and mobility assistance for people with unpredictable physical conditions. His training had been extensive and comprehensive, teaching him to recognize the early warning signs of his handler's episodes, to provide physical support when needed, to position himself as a living brace when Major Tom felt an episode coming on, and to alert others when his handler needed immediate medical attention. Diesel had been trained to bark in specific patterns, to fetch emergency medication, to activate medical alert devices, and to provide deep pressure therapy during recovery periods. The bond between Major Tom and Diesel had grown stronger with each passing day. Diesel seemed to understand not just the mechanics of his handler's condition, but the emotional toll it took on the proud former engineer. On good days, Diesel would accompany Major Tom on gentle walks through their neighborhood, always alert, always watching for signs of an impending episode. On difficult days, when Major Tom felt imprisoned by his own body's unpredictability, Diesel would simply lie beside him, providing comfort through his quiet, steady presence. But today was meant to be a special day, a day of celebration and nostalgia that Major Tom had been planning for months. The Chicago Railroad Historical Society had announced that they were bringing a fully restored 1940s steam locomotive, the very same model that Major Tom had operated during his early years on the railroad, to Union Station for a special exhibition. For one weekend only, the magnificent engine would be on display in the main concourse, complete with authentic period cars and interactive exhibits about the golden age of American railroading. When Major Tom first heard about the exhibition, his eyes had lit up with a joy that Diesel hadn't seen in months. This wasn't just any train. This was a piece of living history, a connection to the best years of his life, a chance to see and perhaps even touch the type of locomotive that had been his second home for so many years. Despite the risks that his condition posed, despite the crowds and chaos that such an event would surely bring, Major Tom was determined to make this pilgrimage to see his beloved steam engine one more time. The morning of their journey dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Major Tom's small apartment near the old rail yards. He had dressed carefully in his finest clothes, a navy blue suit that he had worn to railroad retirement ceremonies and special occasions, polished black shoes that reflected the morning light, and most importantly, the golden railroad pocket watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. The watch had kept perfect time through 3 generations of railroad men, and Major Tom wore it now as a connection to the proud legacy he represented. Diesel sensed the importance of this day from the moment they began their preparations. The intelligent Labrador watched as Major Tom moved with unusual care and deliberation, taking extra time with his appearance, checking and rechecking his medications, reviewing the detailed plans they had made for navigating the crowded station safely. Diesel's training had taught him to be extra vigilant during times when his handler was experiencing heightened emotions, and today definitely qualified as one of those days. The journey to Union Station took them through the heart of Chicago, past familiar landmarks that held decades of memories for Major Tom. As their taxi wound through the city streets, Major Tom pointed out locations where he had worked, places where significant events in his railroad career had occurred, yards where he had trained younger engineers, crossing where he had prevented accidents through quick thinking and expert handling of his locomotive. Diesel listened to every word, his intelligent brown eyes watching his handler's face, monitoring for any signs of the dangerous emotional intensity that could trigger an episode. Union Station appeared before them like a cathedral of transportation, its magnificent Beaux-Arts architecture rising majestically above the surrounding cityscape. The building's limestone facade was adorned with classical columns and intricate carved details that spoke of an era when train travel was considered the height of elegance and sophistication. As they approached the main entrance, Major Tom could already hear the sounds that had defined his life: the distant rumble of trains, the echoing announcements, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks that seemed to call to him across the decades. The moment they stepped through the massive bronze doors into the Great Hall, Major Tom was transported back in time. The soaring ceiling stretched 90 feet above them, supported by massive columns and adorned with elaborate plasterwork that had witnessed millions of travelers over the decades. Shafts of sunlight streamed through enormous windows, creating dramatic patterns of light and shadow across the polished marble floors. The air was filled with the complex symphony of a major transportation hub, conversations in dozens of languages, the rolling of suitcases across marble, the constant stream of announcements echoing through the vast space, and underneath it all, the deeper rumble of trains arriving and departing from the platforms below. But it was the sight at the center of the Great Hall that took Major Tom's breath away and sent his heart racing with dangerous intensity. There, positioned on a specially constructed display track, was the most beautiful locomotive he had ever seen. The 1943 Pennsylvania Railroad K4's Pacific-class steam engine gleamed under specially installed spotlights, its black paint so perfectly restored that it seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. The locomotive's massive driving wheels, each one taller than a person, were positioned as if frozen in mid-motion, ready to surge forward and pull a string of passenger cars across the American landscape. Chrome details caught and threw back the light in brilliant flashes, while brass fittings glowed with the warm patina of authentic restoration. Steam rose dramatically from various points on the engine, not the superheated steam of active operation, but carefully controlled theatrical steam that added to the locomotive's majestic presence without posing any safety risks to the crowds of visitors. The effect was absolutely breathtaking, creating the illusion that this magnificent machine was alive, breathing, ready to spring into action at any moment. Period-dressed conductors and engineers stood beside the display, ready to answer questions and share stories about the golden age of steam locomotion. Major Tom stood transfixed, his hand unconsciously reaching for Diesel's harness as the full emotional impact of the moment began to overwhelm him. This wasn't just a restored locomotive. This was a perfect recreation of the engines he had operated during the most meaningful years of his career. Every detail was exactly as he remembered, From the configuration of the gauges in the cab to the precise positioning of the headlight and warning bells. He could almost hear the familiar sounds of steam pressure building, the rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff of the pistons, the melodic whistle that had announced their approach to countless stations across the Midwest. The crowd swirled around them like a river of humanity, tourists snapping photographs, railroad enthusiasts studying every technical detail, families with children pointing excitedly at the massive machine, elderly visitors sharing their own memories of the great age of passenger rail travel. The noise level was incredible, a constant din of conversation, footsteps, announcements, and the general chaos of thousands of people moving through a confined space. Under normal circumstances, such crowds would have made Major Tom uncomfortable, but today he barely noticed them. His entire attention was focused on the magnificent locomotive before him, and with each passing moment, the emotional intensity was building to dangerous levels. Diesel felt the change immediately. His handler's breathing had become shallow and rapid. His grip on the harness had tightened significantly. And most importantly, Diesel could sense the building tension in Major Tom's muscles that always preceded a cataplectic episode. The dog positioned himself more carefully, ready to provide stability and support, his training kicking in automatically as he prepared for what seemed to be an inevitable collapse. As they moved closer to the locomotive display, Major Tom began sharing memories with Diesel, his voice growing more animated and emotional with each story. He told Diesel about the first time he had been allowed to operate one of these magnificent machines, how it had felt to have all that power responding to his commands, how the engine had seemed to have a personality of its own, moods and quirks that an experienced engineer learned to read and respond to. He described the feeling of pulling a long passenger train through mountain valleys at sunrise, the responsibility of carrying hundreds of people safely to their destinations, the pride of maintaining perfect schedules despite weather and mechanical challenges. The locomotive's whistle suddenly came to life, a deep, melodious sound that echoed through the great hall and sent chills down the spines of everyone present. It was exactly the sound that Major Tom remembered from his working days, a sound that had signaled the beginning of countless journeys, the call to adventure that had defined his entire adult life. The emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. Major Tom's eyes filled with tears of joy and nostalgia. His heart rate spiked dramatically, and the dangerous neurochemical cascade that triggered his cataplexy began flowing through his brain. He felt it beginning, that familiar and terrifying sensation of losing control over his own body. His legs began to feel weak and unsteady, his arms started to go limp, and his facial muscles began to relax beyond his control. "Diesel," he whispered, the word barely audible as his speech began to slur. "It's happening." These would be the last words he would be able to speak for the next several minutes, maybe longer, as his body prepared to betray him in the most public and vulnerable way possible. Diesel immediately moved into position, pressing against Major Tom's legs to provide stability, but it was already too late. The cataplectic episode was in full swing, and no amount of canine support could prevent what was about to happen. Major Tom's knees buckled, his arms went completely limp, and he collapsed to the marble floor of Union Station like a marionette whose strings had been suddenly cut. His body crumpled in a heap beside the rope barriers that separated visitors from the locomotive display, and there he lay, completely paralyzed but fully conscious, trapped inside his own unresponsive body while hundreds of people continued to swirl around him. The cruel irony of his condition meant that Major Tom was completely aware of everything that was happening to him. He could see the feet of passers-by stepping around him, could hear fragments of conversation as people noticed his collapse, could feel the cold hardness of the marble floor against his cheek. But he was completely powerless to communicate his need for help. His eyes remained open, but unblinking, staring sightlessly at the forest of legs that moved past him. He could hear Diesel whimpering beside him, could sense his faithful companion's distress, but he couldn't even turn his head to look at his dog. This is where our story takes a heartbreaking turn that will make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature and compassion. If you're feeling the emotional weight of Major Tom's terrifying situation, if you're wondering how anyone could ignore someone so clearly in distress, then you understand exactly why stories like this need to be told. Take a moment to hit that like button if this story is touching your heart. And let us know in the comments what you would do if you encountered someone like Major Tom who needed help but couldn't ask for it. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories that celebrate the incredible bonds between humans and animals. What happened next was a devastating commentary on modern urban life and the way we've learned to look past each other's suffering. The first person to notice Major Tom's collapsed form was a businessman in an expensive suit, speaking rapidly into a Bluetooth headset about quarterly earnings and market projections. He glanced down at the motionless figure on the floor, made a quick assessment that this was probably a homeless person who had found a place to sleep, and stepped carefully around the obstacle without breaking stride in his important phone conversation. A group of teenage tourists approached next, their attention focused on taking selfies with the locomotive in the background. One of them almost tripped over Major Tom's outstretched arm, looked down with annoyance and muttered something about drunk people ruining everyone else's experience. They repositioned themselves to get a better camera angle that didn't include the inconvenient person on the floor, snapped their photos and moved on to the next exhibit without giving Major Tom another thought. An elderly woman with a walking cane paused beside Major Tom's motionless form and seemed to study him more carefully than the others had. For a moment, Major Tom felt a surge of hope that finally someone would recognize his distress and summon help. The woman bent down slightly, squinting at his face, and Major Tom tried desperately to make eye contact, to somehow communicate his desperate need for assistance. But after a few seconds, the woman straightened up, shook her head disapprovingly, and walked away, apparently concluding that he was intoxicated or on drugs, and therefore not deserving of her concern. This pattern repeated itself over and over again as the minutes stretched by with agonizing slowness. Business travelers hurried past, focused on catching their trains. Families with children steered their little ones away from the man on the floor, using his presence as a teaching moment about the dangers of bad life choices. Security guards walked by on their regular patrols, but Union Station saw so many people sleeping in corners and alcoves that one more motionless figure didn't register as particularly unusual or worthy of investigation. The most heartbreaking aspect of Major Tom's ordeal was his complete awareness of how he appeared to others. He knew that lying motionless on the floor in an expensive suit made him look like a businessman who had suffered some kind of breakdown, possibly alcohol-related, possibly drug-related, possibly just the kind of mental health crisis that made people uncomfortable and eager to avoid involvement. He understood why people were walking past him, why they were making assumptions about his character and his situation, but he was powerless to correct their misperceptions or explain his legitimate medical emergency. Diesel, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated and distressed. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario, and he immediately began implementing the emergency protocols he had been taught. He positioned himself protectively beside his handler, placed his head on Major Tom's chest to provide comfort and warmth, and began his trained alert behaviors designed to attract attention and summon help. The intelligent Labrador started with his standard medical alert sequence, a specific pattern of barking that had been designed to communicate urgency without causing panic. He would bark 3 times, pause for 5 seconds, bark 3 times again, pause, and repeat the cycle. This was the universally recognized signal that service dogs use to indicate a medical emergency, requiring immediate assistance. In a quiet residential neighborhood or a small public space, this alert would have been impossible to ignore and would have brought help within minutes. But in the cacophonous environment of Union Station's Great Hall, Diesel's carefully trained alert barks were completely lost in the ambient noise. The constant stream of announcements over the public address system, the conversations of thousands of people, the rumble of trains, the general acoustic chaos of the massive space, all combined to swallow up his urgent calls for help. Even people who were walking directly past them seemed not to hear the dog's distressed barking. Or if they did hear it, they assumed it was just a poorly behaved pet that was excited by all the activity. Diesel tried variations of his training, approaching nearby people and pawing at their legs to get their attention, then leading them back toward his collapsed handler. But every person he approached either ignored him completely or pushed him away, assuming he was just a friendly dog looking for attention or treats. Some people seemed annoyed by his approaches, treating him as a nuisance rather than recognizing his obvious distress and purposeful behavior. The desperate dog tried every technique in his extensive training repertoire. He attempted to activate the medical alert device that Major Tom wore around his neck, but the device had been damaged in the fall and was not responding to his pawing. He tried to retrieve Major Tom's emergency medication from the bag they carried, but the medication was useless for a cataplectic episode and wouldn't help even if he could somehow administer it. He even tried the deep pressure therapy he had been trained to provide, lying across his handler's body to provide calming weight and warmth, but Major Tom remained locked in his paralyzed state. As the minutes ticked by and turned into a quarter hour, then 20 minutes, Diesel's distress reached critical levels. His handler was lying motionless on a cold marble floor, surrounded by hundreds of people who could help but weren't helping, and every method he had been trained to use was proving completely ineffective in this environment. The dog began to pace in tight circles around Major Tom's prone form, whimpering with frustration and fear, his intelligent mind searching desperately for some solution that hadn't been covered in his training. It was during this desperate search for alternatives that Diesel's remarkable intelligence began to assert itself in ways that would soon leave everyone speechless. The dog began to study his environment with the focused intensity of an engineer solving a complex problem. He observed the flow of people through the Great Hall, noting how they moved in predictable patterns, following the paths of least resistance, avoiding obstacles and disturbances. He noticed how people responded to different types of sounds and visual cues, how they reacted to authority figures, how they behaved when their normal routines were disrupted. Most importantly, Diesel began to understand something that would prove crucial to what happened next. In this environment, his handler had become invisible not because people were cruel or heartless, but because the normal social signals that indicated someone needed help were completely overwhelmed by the noise and chaos of the station. Major Tom looked like he was sleeping or intoxicated, not like someone experiencing a medical emergency. Diesel's barking sounded like normal dog noise, not like an urgent call for help. In this environment, subtle signals were useless. What was needed was something impossible to ignore, something that would force everyone to stop what they were doing and pay attention. Diesel's gaze began to sweep the Great Hall systematically, cataloging every element of the environment that might be useful in his desperate mission to save his handler. He noted the locations of security cameras, the positions of authority figures, the placement of emergency equipment, the routes that people used to move through the space. And then, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on something that made his tail stop wagging and his entire body go rigid with sudden understanding. There, mounted on a marble pillar approximately 30 feet from where Major Tom lay motionless, was a bright red emergency fire alarm pull station. The device was positioned at exactly the right height for a large dog to reach, protected by a clear plastic cover that was designed to prevent accidental activation, but not to prevent access during a real emergency. The alarm was connected to the station's main emergency systems, the same systems that would immediately alert the Chicago Fire Department, trigger automatic emergency protocols, and most importantly, bring every security officer and emergency responder in the building running to investigate. Diesel stared at the fire alarm for several long seconds, his remarkable canine intelligence processing the implications of what he was considering. He had never been trained to activate fire alarms. In fact, his training had specifically emphasized the importance of never interfering with emergency equipment unless specifically commanded to do so by his handler. But his handler was unconscious and unable to give commands, and every conventional method of summoning help had failed completely. The intelligent dog understood instinctively that activating a fire alarm when there was no fire would be considered improper, possibly even illegal. He understood that it would cause panic, confusion, and disruption for thousands of people. He understood that he would likely get in trouble for his actions, and that his handler might face consequences as well. But he also understood, with the crystal clarity that comes from pure desperation, that this was his only remaining option to save the human he loved more than his own life. Diesel looked back at Major Tom's motionless form one more time, noting how his handler's skin was beginning to look pale, and how his breathing seemed more shallow than it had been earlier. Cataplectic episodes were not usually life-threatening, but they could become dangerous if the person remained collapsed on a hard surface for extended periods, especially in a crowded environment where they might be stepped on or further injured by oblivious passers-by. Making a decision that would have impressed the most seasoned emergency responder, Diesel began to make his way through the crowd toward the fire alarm. He moved with purpose and determination, weaving between legs and luggage, his intelligent eyes fixed on his target. Several people noticed the large dog moving through the crowd and assumed he was looking for his owner, or chasing something interesting. None of them suspected that they were witnessing one of the most remarkable acts of canine problem-solving ever recorded. When Diesel reached the marble pillar, he reared up on his hind legs and studied the fire alarm mechanism carefully. The clear plastic cover was held in place by a simple hinge mechanism that would open when the red handle was pulled downward. The design was intended to be activated by human hands, but Diesel's careful observation revealed that it could also be activated by a determined dog with sufficient size and intelligence. The brave Labrador took a deep breath, looked once more across the great hall toward his paralyzed handler, and made his move. He stretched up to his full height, opened his powerful jaws, and carefully grasped the red alarm handle in his teeth. The plastic cover flipped open with a small click, and for just a moment Diesel hesitated. This was the point of no return. Once he pulled this handle, there would be no way to undo what he was about to do. No way to explain his actions to the humans, who would surely be angry and confused by what appeared to be a completely inappropriate response to a non-emergency situation. But then, Diesel heard a sound that made his decision for him. From across the great hall, barely audible above the ambient noise, came a soft moan from Major Tom's direction. His handler was showing signs of distress, possibly indicating that the cataplectic episode was deepening or that complications were developing. Without another moment's hesitation, Diesel bit down on the fire alarm handle and pulled with all his strength. The effect was absolutely instantaneous and more dramatic than even Diesel could have anticipated. The moment the alarm mechanism activated, every speaker in Union Station erupted with the ear-piercing wail of emergency sirens. The sound was so loud and penetrating that every conversation stopped mid-sentence, every phone call was interrupted, every tourist stopped taking pictures, and every hurried traveler froze in place. The acoustic assault was so overwhelming that it seemed to physically push against the walls of the Great Hall, creating an environment where communication was impossible, and the only rational response was to focus completely on the emergency at hand. Simultaneously with the audio alarm, the station's emergency lighting system activated, bathing the entire Great Hall in flashing red light that strobed in perfect synchronization with the sirens. The effect transformed the elegant transportation hub into something resembling an emergency command center, with every surface reflecting the urgent red glow that indicated immediate danger and the need for evacuation procedures. The response from station personnel was immediate and professional. Within 15 seconds of the alarm activation, security officers were running toward the source of the alarm from multiple directions, their radios crackling with urgent communications as they coordinated their response to what they assumed was a serious fire emergency. The station's public address system crackled to life with pre-recorded evacuation instructions, directing people to move calmly toward the nearest exits while emergency personnel investigated the situation. But the most remarkable aspect of the scene was the reaction of the crowd. Thousands of people who had been completely oblivious to Major Tom's medical emergency just moments before were now standing perfectly still, their attention focused entirely on identifying and responding to whatever threat had triggered such a dramatic alarm. The cacophony of normal station noise had been replaced by the focused silence of people listening for instructions and watching for signs of danger. Diesel, meanwhile, had immediately returned to his position beside Major Tom, sitting alertly next to his handler's motionless form, as if nothing unusual had happened. To anyone observing the scene, it appeared that the dog was simply staying close to his owner during the emergency, showing the kind of loyalty and protective instinct that people expected from a well-trained service animal. None of the security officers racing toward the activated alarm had any reason to suspect that the dog himself was responsible for the emergency response that was now unfolding around them. The first security officer to reach the fire alarm pull station was Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department who had been assigned to Union Station security for the past 3 years. Rodriguez was expecting to find either a fire, evidence of a fire, or at minimum a panicked person who had activated the alarm in response to some perceived emergency. What she found instead was a completely normal-looking fire alarm pull station with no signs of fire, no smoke, no heat, and no obvious reason for activation. Rodriguez immediately began scanning the area around the alarm, looking for any indication of what might have triggered the emergency response. She checked nearby trash cans for signs of smoldering, examined electrical outlets for sparking, looked up at the ceiling for signs of smoke or water leaks, and surveyed the crowd for anyone who appeared to be in distress or behaving suspiciously. Her trained eyes swept systematically across every possible source of emergency, but she found absolutely nothing that would explain why the fire alarm had been activated. It was during this methodical search that Rodriguez's attention was caught by an unusual sight about 30 feet away from the alarm pole station. There, in the middle of the great hall's marble floor, a large chocolate Labrador was sitting alertly beside what appeared to be a well-dressed man who was lying motionless on the ground. Even from a distance, something about the scene struck Rodriguez as significant, though she couldn't immediately put her finger on what was bothering her about it. Rodriguez activated her radio and reported her initial findings to the station command center. "Control, this is Rodriguez at the fire alarm activation site. I have no visual confirmation of fire or smoke at this location. The alarm appears to have been activated, but I cannot determine the cause. I am expanding my search area to investigate a possible medical situation approximately 30 feet from the alarm location. Please maintain emergency protocols until further notice." As Rodriguez approached Major Tom and Diesel, she was joined by Officer James Patterson, a younger officer who had been patrolling the opposite end of the Great Hall when the alarm sounded. Patterson was slightly out of breath from his sprint across the station, and his first question reflected the confusion that all the responding officers were feeling. "Any sign of fire?" he asked Rodriguez, even as his own eyes swept the area for obvious sources of emergency. "Nothing obvious," Rodriguez replied, her attention now focused entirely on the motionless man and his canine companion. "But we've got what looks like a medical situation here that might be related to the alarm activation." As they drew closer, both officers could see that the man appeared to be unconscious but breathing, lying in a position that suggested he had collapsed suddenly rather than lying down intentionally. Diesel watched the approaching officers with intense attention, his tail beginning to wag slightly as he recognized that his desperate gambit was finally bringing the help that his handler so desperately needed. The intelligent dog remained in his protective position beside Major Tom, but his entire body language communicated relief and hope as uniformed authority figures finally took notice of their situation. Rodriguez knelt beside Major Tom and immediately began her assessment using the standard emergency response protocols she had learned during her police training. She quickly checked for signs of life, confirmed that he was breathing regularly, looked for obvious signs of injury or trauma, and attempted to get a response by calling his name and gently tapping his shoulder. When these standard techniques produced no response, she reached for his wrist to check for identification and emergency medical information. It was at this moment that Rodriguez made the discovery that would begin to unravel the mystery of the fire alarm activation. Attached to Major Tom's wrist was a medical alert bracelet that identified him as having narcolepsy with cataplexy, provided emergency contact information, and most importantly, explained that he might appear unconscious while actually being fully aware of his surroundings but unable to respond or communicate. "Patterson," Rodriguez called to her partner, "this gentleman has a medical condition that causes temporary paralysis. He's probably conscious and aware right now even though he can't respond to us. We need to get EMS here immediately, and we need to treat this as a medical emergency, not a routine unconscious person call." Patterson immediately activated his radio to request emergency medical services, while Rodriguez continued her assessment of Major Tom's condition. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of Diesel's behavior, which seemed unusually focused and purposeful for a dog whose owner was experiencing a medical emergency. The Labrador was clearly a service animal, based on his harness and professional demeanor, but there was something about his alertness and the way he was watching the officers that suggested a level of intelligence and involvement that went beyond normal service animal behavior. It was Patterson who first verbalized the question that both officers were beginning to consider. "Rodriguez," he said, lowering his voice so that his words wouldn't carry to the growing crowd of onlookers, "do you think there's any chance that this dog somehow activated that fire alarm?" The question sounded absurd even as he asked it, but both officers had noticed that the alarm pole station was at exactly the right height for a large dog to reach, and the timing of the alarm activation coinciding with a medical emergency seemed too convenient to be purely coincidental. Rodriguez looked from the fire alarm pull station to Diesel and back again, her mind working through the implications of what Patterson was suggesting. "It seems impossible," she said slowly. "But let's think about this logically. We have a man with a medical condition that causes him to collapse and become unable to communicate. We have a service dog who is trained to get help when his handler is in distress. We have a fire alarm that was activated for no apparent reason, at exactly the time when this medical emergency was occurring, and the alarm is positioned at exactly the height that this dog could reach." As if sensing that he was the subject of their conversation, Diesel rose to his feet and walked deliberately toward the fire alarm pull station. Both officers watched in amazement as the intelligent dog sat down directly beneath the alarm, looked up at the red handle, then turned back to look at them with what could only be described as an expression of satisfied accomplishment. "I'll be damned," Patterson whispered, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "I think that dog actually did pull the fire alarm to get help for his owner." Rodriguez stared at Diesel for several long seconds, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. In 15 years of police work, she had seen countless examples of human ingenuity, desperation, and problem-solving under pressure. She had witnessed people overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, find creative solutions to life-threatening problems, and demonstrate remarkable resourcefulness in emergency situations. But she had never, not even once, seen an animal demonstrate the kind of complex reasoning and strategic thinking that Diesel appeared to have used in this situation. The implications of what they were discovering began to sink in as Rodriguez and Patterson pieced together the full scope of what had happened. Diesel had recognized that his handler was experiencing a medical emergency. He had attempted to use his standard training to summon help, but those methods had proven ineffective in the chaotic environment of Union Station. Rather than simply continuing to repeat ineffective behaviors, the remarkable dog had assessed his environment, identified an alternative solution that would guarantee an immediate response from emergency personnel, and had taken decisive action despite the fact that his chosen method was completely outside his formal training. "This is unprecedented," Rodriguez said, her voice filled with professional admiration and personal amazement. "This dog didn't just follow his training. He improvised a solution to a problem his training couldn't solve. He used human emergency systems in a way that no dog has ever been trained to do, and he did it because it was the only way to save his handler's life." By this time, emergency medical services had arrived on the scene, and paramedics were beginning their assessment of Major Tom's condition. The senior paramedic, Lisa Chen, had extensive experience with neurological emergencies and immediately recognized the signs of a cataplectic episode. Working with practiced efficiency, Chen and her team began the process of monitoring Major Tom's vital signs, ensuring his airway remained clear and preparing for his eventual recovery from the paralytic state. "How long has he been down?" Chen asked Rodriguez, even as she attached monitoring equipment to Major Tom's chest and arms. "We're not exactly sure," Rodriguez replied, "but based on witness statements and our investigation, we estimate somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. The remarkable thing is that his service dog activated the fire alarm to get our attention when conventional methods of summoning help weren't working in this environment." Chen looked up from her patient to study Diesel with new interest. "Are you telling me that this dog pulled the fire alarm as a way to get help for a medical emergency?" "That's exactly what we're telling you," Patterson interjected, his voice still filled with wonder at what they had discovered. "We've reconstructed the entire sequence of events and there's no other logical explanation. This dog assessed the situation, determined that normal emergency protocols weren't going to work in this environment, identified an alternative method of summoning help, and executed his plan flawlessly." As Chen continued her medical assessment of Major Tom, she began to explain to the officers what made Diesel's actions even more remarkable than they realized. "Cataplectic episodes can be very dangerous if the person remains collapsed for extended periods," she said. "The paralysis affects all voluntary muscles, including those involved in maintaining proper circulation and breathing. If this gentleman had remained on this cold, hard floor much longer, he could have developed serious complications including blood clots, breathing difficulties, or circulatory problems." The paramedic's words drove home the life-or-death nature of the situation that Diesel,